This video is the second part of an attempt to summarize and explain the philosophical standpoint of Jacques Lacan's interpretation of Freudian psychoanalysis that underlies the methodology of my video lectures. More needs to be said concerning the status of Lacan's theoretical formulation from the standpoint of feminist criticism, as a starting point for identifying themes that can be useful for other modes of criticism, queer, trans, etc. At first glance, Lacan's concept of the phallus appears to fall under the horizon of the feminist criticism of Freud's Oedipal theory. Freud's account of castration anxiety as the basis for the formation of the psyche presumes a male and heterosexual normativity for the psyche that excludes the experience of women, homosexuals, and those who are transgender, for example, who are thereby implicitly deprived of the full status as subjects. For example, Freud theorizes women as achieving sexualization through penis envy. They are deprived of access to the male and heterosexual subject's normative phallic stage of development, following the oral and anal stages, because they biologically allegedly have no penis. This common sense observation thereby misses the fact, conveniently, that is to say, accompanied with an ideological excess of signification, that women are not thereby deprived of their own genital organs at a corresponding stage of adult psychological development related to their distinct female mode of sexual enjoyment. Alternative valences of genital symbolism, the vagina, for example, or the diverse hybrid variations of hermaphroditic genitalia, are obscured by privileging the phallus as the archetypal form of libidinal representation. Lacan's concept of the phallus, it can be plausibly argued, stands under the shadow of this line of criticism. Judith Butler's treatment of this issue in Gender Trouble will serve to summarize the critical issues pertaining to the Lacanian phallus. For Butler, Lacan, quote, poses the relation between the sexes in terms that reveal the speaking I as a masculinized effect of repression, one which postures as an autonomous and self-grounding subject, but whose very coherence is called into question by the sexual positions that it excludes in the process of identity formation, unquote. That is to say, quote, the symbolic order creates cultural intelligibility through the mutually exclusive positions of having the phallus, the social position of men, and being the phallus, the social position of women, especially as posited by male visual interpretation, or what Lacan calls the gaze. The interdependency of these positions recalls the Hegelian structure of failed reciprocity between master and slave regarding the unexpected dependency of the master on the slave to establish their own identity through reflection, unquote. However, due to this reflected ontologically ungrounded status of gender identity, no gender role can fulfill the sexual fantasy of restoring the primordial narcissism of the real. Therefore, for Lacan, quote, all gender ontology is reducible to the play of appearances, unquote. Or in other words, for Lacan, gender is an unreal fantasy. Biological gender essentialism is negated within Lacanian theory. Our relationship to the diverse morphology of genital biology is socially constructed insofar as it is sexualized. The biological penis, for example, is simply a flabby protuberance of skin. It only takes on the role of standing for the phallus when incorporated into the socio-linguistically constructed context of sexual activity. Hence, biologically male infants have not yet symbolically conflated their penis with the phallus and must still be gradually trained in the social role of being men, historically, well after the physical details of their biological genitalia have been cataloged by the gaze and the person assigned a class role within the prevailing political economy of the symbolic order. The symbolic association of the penis with the phallus and the male set of social roles and behaviors this is presumed to facilitate are gradually acquired through linguistic socialization, especially through experience of the gender roles played out within the family. Julia Kristeva characterizes the socially constructed performance of gender as a masquerade, a fictional play which the actors involved nevertheless treat as being real, and of viewing their own identities in terms of their performances within the virtual reality of gender. However, Butler argues this is not the whole story. She writes, quote, "There is a being or ontological specification of femininity prior to the masquerade, a feminine desire or demand that is masked and capable of disclosure, that indeed might promise an eventual disruption and displacement of the phallogocentric signifying economy," unquote. There positively exists, quote, "some prior ontological femininity regularly underrepresented by the phallic economy," unquote. And Butler's idea is that the representation of this can displace the phallus as the central organizing archetype of the patriarchal symbolic order and allow the authentic identity formation of women and the establishment of, quote, "the boundaries of a feminine gendered position," unquote. On the basis of this allegedly missing option within Lacan's discourse, Butler eventually, in her theory, rejects the privileging of the phallus within her theory of gender difference. In reference to the patriarchal law of the father signified by the phallus, Butler declares, quote, "What plausibility can be given to an account of the symbolic that requires a conformity to the law that proves impossible to perform and that makes no room for the flexibility of the law itself, its cultural reformation in more plastic forms," unquote. So much for Judith Butler's position. Butler's appeal to a primordial, immediately existing feminine desire that would positively ground and stabilize the boundaries of an experience outside patriarchy is rejected by Slavoj Žižek in his defense of Lacan. Žižek's engagement with the feminist critique of Lacan finds its most sustained and developed expression in The Metastases of Enjoyment from 1994, and I will focus on this text to represent his position. Žižek's counterattack hinges on Butler's objection to the plausibility of Lacan's concept of the symbolic due to its exclusion of the possibility for cultural reformation. Žižek argues that Lacan's materialism affirms the historicity and therefore the potential mutability of the patriarchal symbolic order. Furthermore, his reading of Lacan's theory denies that Butler's appeal to the authenticity of women's experience is sufficient to either adequately theorize or causally affect such a reformation, because the role or status of gender as such is overdetermined by patriarchy, which ideologically permeates the social grammar of our everyday language usage. The symbolic order is not simply patriarchal semantically, reverting to a neutral medium of communication when we personally decide that we no longer believe in patriarchy. The symbolic is patriarchal syntactically, baked into the grammar of the underlying structure of language. The status of nouns and the function of grammatical nomination throughout history has always already presumed the economically posited social existence of gendered classes in a non-egalitarian relationship to each other. The connection between language and patriarchy consists in the link between the correspondence socially assumed to exist between signifiers and their signified objects of reference, and the role of the father or master who is invested with the social authority to establish the normative correspondences between signifier and signified. For example, Adam in the book of Genesis acts as the archetypal father by speaking the names of all the animals as they are paraded before him. Quote, "And whatever the man called," the man here is the word Adam, "and whatever the Adam called every living creature, that was its name." And that's Genesis chapter 2, verses 19 to 20. Male authority defines the animal's roles within the symbolic order of the agrarian mode of production. Because all historical human societies have possessed a patriarchal division of labor, the logos, or ground of linguistic intelligibility, has always been privileged to the male function within the phallic symbolic order, not because intelligibility is somehow inherently male, but because the order of society is structurally patriarchal. The negation of patriarchy would mean the negation of the social normativity of binary gender as such, resulting in the negation of women as well as men, not the repressed appearance of an authentic feminine experience that stood outside the patriarchal social order. It is ultimately a masculine perspective that posits the existence of authentically bounded gender experience. In fact, there is no position or possibility for immediately authentic gendered experience because all gender positions, heterosexual, homosexual, transgender, gender fluid, intersex, etc., are phantasmal roles interpolated by the overarching grammatical structure of the historically patriarchal symbolic order. Without that framework, the fantasy of gender simply collapses, and with it goes the Oedipal frame of reference, sustaining the modern subject's very sense of psychological identity. Furthermore, Žižek writes, quote, "Those who conceive of the phallic signifier as a privileged image or bodily part that provides the central point of reference, enabling the subject to totalize the dispersed multitude of erogenous zones into a unique, hierarchically ordered totality, reproach Lacan with what is actually his fundamental insight. This coordination through the central phallic image necessarily fails," unquote. It is precisely the primordial, basic, genetic crisis or deadlock of the psyche's desire, which founds the falsely misrecognized and ideological sense of normativity and universality of the phallic metaphor within the subject's representations. Žižek writes, quote, "This universal surplus, this capacity of sexuality to overflow the entire field of human experience so that everything can acquire a sexual connotation, is not the sign of its preponderance. Rather, it is the sign of a certain structural faultiness. Sexuality strives outward and overflows the adjoining domains precisely because it cannot find satisfaction in itself, because it never attains its goal," unquote. In contrast, Judith Butler's position instead posits an immediate, direct, and authentic woman's experience that stands outside of the phallic symbolic order of globalized modernity. Žižek's claim is simply that there is no such position. The phallic order can only be exceeded and exploded from within the domain of its logic, in and through the surplus or excess significations built into the very structure of its failed, incomplete, and contradictory appearance of self-totality. The phallic symbolic carries its own negation within itself. It is in itself its own opposition. All alternatives to the phallic order posited in terms of the identity politics of an immediate experience of gender self-difference are always already still internal to the phallic order. They do not stand outside the system but appear folded within its structure. Again, this is not to deny the positive role played by the admittedly diverse social experiences of different genders in undermining the ramparts of the patriarchal order as they historically develop and assert themselves. But this development is still within the historically given symbolic order of society. Patriarchy has been engaged in civil war, yet it has not yet been adequately revolutionized. Correspondingly, subjects within globalization have no immediate access to a purely psychological experience or affect outside of the capitalist division of labor and the phallic symbolic order, which functions as its linguistic symptom, as sublated and preserved from earlier economic epochs. The survival and reproduction of patriarchy requires today's critical thinkers to self-consciously grasp themselves as embedded agents within the cultural force field of capital, ever on their guard against the ideological fantasies of liberal consensus reality. Popular culture is a collective dream fantasy under the spell of market alienation, and merely allowing the diversity of gender to be representable in popular culture does not change the class system within which the representation of gender appears. Critically insurgent theorists should therefore not directly join in the call for Butler's liberal reformation of the phallic symbolic, but instead try to go further and demand a radical revolution of the material division of economic labor, such that the normative social status of the nuclear child-rearing family is dissolved and replaced with an egalitarian diversity of social options of human cohabitation and collective reproduction. Then, if some people still want to get paired up and raise children together, they are, of course, welcome to do so. The concept of revolution in its fully socialist sense is unthinkable without engagement to the larger historical context of class struggle. Without this larger international horizon of concern, the all too liberal limits of woman's experience all too often are defined by the smug clique consciousness of white, bourgeois, suburban housewives. The same criticism potentially applies to homosexual experience as well, which has kept pace with its growing cultural acceptance by becoming increasingly consumerist and bourgeois in content. Transgender experience will likewise soon be reassimilated to the class system. All these potentially subversive, indeed, in many ways, genuinely subversive gender positions will simply be reconformed to bourgeois experience and their revolutionary potential neutralized until the phallic capitalist order has been superseded by a political economy where the family has been practically abolished and human identity in terms of gender is no longer historically determined by the subject's arbitrary, preposited location within the division of reproductive labor. Short of this goal, the grammar of patriarchy will, in the meantime, continue to reassert itself within whatever valence the cultural superstructure manifests, as long as the material social relations of economic production continue to be constituted by patriarchal norms. As long as a class owns the means of production, nominating themselves as the normative subjects of society, as the father-master in Lacanian terms, it doesn't matter if some of them are women, or even if all of them are, because in that circumstance the signifier called woman would simply be inverted in its semiotic location in opposition to the signifier man, but without the social contradiction of their asymmetrical power relation being altered at all. The phallus would now be a property owned by women, conferring upon them normative status as subjects. However, this relation would remain formally patriarchal, or rather perhaps we might say paternal, even while the biological criterion for membership in the normative class would be potentially inverted. This is why the concept of matriarchy proves ultimately to be a false category. Matriarchy both sublimates and perpetuates the trauma of patriarchal social relations by reifying women's power into just another appearance of phallic authority. The naive crypto-ethnic feminism just described should be held in strict distinction from the theoretical praxis of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and its critical historical successors, Luce Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, etc., where woman is defined as an existential project. That is to say, the concept of woman is left undefined and unfilled, designating a subject seeking to make themselves through their activity, yet never formally fully bounded or defined by that activity. The crucial insight of the critically historicized feminism represented by de Beauvoir and her followers is that there is no such thing as a woman because there is no such thing as a man. Gender is a social construction, never a natural or metaphysical essence. In summary, Monique Wittig states the politically correct, I use this term without irony or apology, formulation of what I mean when she writes, quote, "In speaking of their genitals, the women do not employ hyperboles, metaphors. They do not proceed sequentially or by gradation. They do not recite long litanies whose refrain is an unending imprecation. They do not strive to multiply the intervals so that in some they signify a deliberate lapse. They say that all these forms denote an outworn language. They say everything must begin over again. They say that a great wind is sweeping the earth. They say that the sun is about to rise."